Hello, everybody. Welcome to Horror 101 with Dr. AC. My name is Aaron Christensen, and tonight we're going to be entering a dimension of sight, of sound, of mind as we cross over into the Twilight Zone. From 1959 to 1964, Rod Serling's television series held sway over viewers, dazzling them with an array of supernatural morality tales, often ending with a wingding twist ending. After capturing the imagination of two generations via syndication, the idea of a big screen treatment eventually landed at the doorstep of golden boy Steven Spielberg, coming off an incredible string of hits, including Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and of course, E.T. the Extra-terrestrial. Spielberg assembled a dream team of directors to helm 4 different episodes, but of course, this is the Twilight Zone, and a darker twist ending lay ahead for all involved. Tonight, 40 years later, we're going to be looking back at the film itself, as well as the tragedy which has loomed large over the project for the past 4 decades. My guests tonight are a dream team themselves of podcasters and authors. We have Dodd Alley, Niall Arena, and Larry Sternshine. Thank you all for coming to the show tonight. We're going to be talking about Twilight Zone, the movie, 1983, celebrating its 40th anniversary. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Let us go and just kind of head around the circle. Dodd, when did you see the film for the first time? Did you see it in the theaters?
No, I was born in 81 and the film came out in 83, so it was not a theatrical experience for me. It was a video store experience. When I was at that age in the late 80s, early 90s, I was too young to see R films, so my Trojan horse or my gateway to horror movies was the PG rating. Mostly the ones that were rated before the advent of the PG-13 rating. And so Twilight Zone, the movie, really screamed to me from the video store shelf. It was in the horror section. It was PG, and it came home with me, and that's how I discovered it.
Cool. Niall?
You know, it was very similar. It was the end of summer, and I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and kind of had worked through all the other things that appealed to me in the video store. And my stepmom thought, oh, yeah, it's PG. It passes the test. And I was summarily then traumatized, especially by the Joe Dante segment. And it kind of, was etched into my brain for many years as the scariest thing I had ever seen. So.
And Larry?
Yeah, for me, I think it was an HBO movie that it happened to be on. So it came out when I was probably like 6 or 7 maybe when I first saw it on HBO. And I was already into cartoons at this point, so like that Joe Dante and that the last segment are the ones that spoke to me. And I think it was around this time too I started really getting into horror as well. I was I don't know if this was good or bad, but like this is like around the time I started getting to see like Nightmare on Elm Street and stuff.
Yeah.
Way too young for that kind of stuff. But these are just like these gateway things, they're like, oh, I can handle this. I can go to the next step, So, but that was definitely an HBO movie for me.
Were you all familiar with the TV show at this point? Or was it kind of like, did it come chicken before the egg?
Oddly enough, at that point, I had not seen very many Twilight Zone episodes. In fact, I think at that time there had been maybe some variation or remake or reboot of it that I saw on cable at that point.
In the 80s,
but,
yeah.
Yeah, but I don't even know if the Sci-Fi Network was even in my home yet. I know that that's where Twilight Zone episodes sort of came into my home. So it might have been the movie that came first for me.
Yeah, I was very aware. There were video cassettes, I think, at the public library that had maybe 2, maybe 3 episodes, kind of rounding out to that 90-minute range. And so the excitement, like, oh, there's a Twilight Zone movie, like, and it seemed still very contemporary. It's that, whatever mid-90s time of the VHS, anything that's on a video cassette must be sometime in the kind of present, the long blur of the present. So yeah, it was with great excitement, in the same way that finding out that there was a He-Man movie, like, oh, well, we gotta see that, we gotta see it all.
Yeah, I honestly probably not. I think it was just one of those things where like maybe my parents would have mentioned like, hey, this was a TV show, maybe I watched an episode, I don't remember. But like being a big movie guy, it was a movie. I was like, oh, this is cool. It's called The Movie. Right. It must be good, But yeah, I don't think I was aware.
Well, and I clearly have just outed myself as being the old grandpa of the group. I had seen quite a few of the Twilight Zone episodes. I don't know that I'd seen any of these episodes because of these 4 that they did for the film, 3 of them are kind of updates of pre-existing episodes, with one being kind of an original that is inspired by another episode. But I hadn't seen any of these episodes, so I didn't know how they were going to end. But there was also a Twilight Zone magazine that was a lot of short stories and just kind of like featurettes on people who would be into the Twilight Zone, you know, like horror kids like me. And I remember there was a cover shot of the gremlin on the wing and like hanging on. And I was like, what is this movie? I got to see it. And, you know, again, because it was PG, this is right at the cusp of PG-13. You know, I think 1984 is when PG-13 came out, but PG was still a thing. And so I got to see it in the theater in 1983. Probably this summer, because we're coming up right up on the anniversary. It came out in June of 1983. And like you, Niall, that Joe Dante movie messed me up. I was like, this is terrifying. And then, of course, you followed up with the gremlin on the wing, which, again, because I'd seen, you know, some previews about that was not as alarming. But yeah, the Joe Dante thing just wigged me out. It was one of the more scarier things I'd seen in the theater. And it was interesting to kind of backtrack and come back around to it 4 decades later and be like, that wasn't as scary as I thought it was. We'll talk about the directors. You know, it was directed by John Landis, Steven Spielberg, Joe Dante, and George Miller. And George Miller's probably, you know, like best known for the Mad Max movies. Joe Dante did Gremlins, and Steven Spielberg, we don't even need to talk about. John Landis, he was coming off of Animal House and American Werewolf in London, and then he would go on to do Trading Places, Coming to America, etc. But what were people's impressions this time around versus perhaps their first time seeing it?
Well, I actually just watched it last night, and that was the first time I had seen it in a couple of decades. But it's one of those movies that have always stuck with me, just because, like the very beginning prologue, the want to see something really scary. I think about that all the time. I mean, that's like in my vernacular, you know what I mean? So it's really fun to kind of revisit. And for me, the so odd. It's definitely a movie that gets better as it goes, because the first 2 segments, especially that second one we'll talk about, it's so great. But like those last 2 still completely hold up, and in many different ways, especially now with how effects are, like those the cartoons that come to life looking like crazy Disney animatronics is unlike anything you would see today. And I think that was the thing that really stood out, was just how it looks compared to movies now.
Yeah, it was interesting. I just watched it again. I've seen it a few times over my life, but I think this is probably the most substantial gap of time that has passed since I've seen it. And it's interesting because I do remember my impression of it, and I mostly prioritized, or the installments that were mostly scary and monstery were my favorite when I was younger. And I remember my least favorite was always the Spielberg installment. And then going into it, the Spielberg installment starts. I'm going, oh boy, here comes the Spielberg installment.
Right.
Well, I'm 41 now. I have kids, and it got me weepy. So it actually was one of my favorites this time, interestingly enough. So
yeah, I think, you know, the biggest thing was, you know, kind of knowing now so much about the tragic events of the Landis short. And so kind of like, okay, and this, you know, it had to alter its ending. And there's, you know, kind of differing narratives that I've read about kind of, you know, how they put it together afterwards. But it's funny watching that one. I think the biggest thing that struck me was that, one, Landis also directs the beginning with Albert Brooks and Dan Aykroyd, which I feel like needs to be given its due. You know, it's like Landis, and then, you know, there's an equal sign tragic Vic Morrow segment. But that first one with Aykroyd and Albert Brooks, I think, is so good. And the fact that they're both comedians, they would have been, you know, kind of known quantities for that at the time. I think like that deserves kind of its due, that then there is this kind of, you know, at least as a child, and still like the switch and just how kind of like bizarre and dream logic-y it is, I really enjoy. But also the Vic Morrow one, for what you get of it, and if it's hard to kind of, you know, square the circle from the events, but I was struck, I think this time, by like, it's still very good, and it has a little bit more of that Serling flavor to me than some of the other ones do. Not that they aren't terrific, and I love them, but the fact that it is just this kind of, it doesn't make sense, and he's in this time loop, and it's this kind of like increasing panic of a guy who feels like he's owed something. And I'd heard someone, I think James Naramore, that film professor, talk about how, where does noir go in the 60s? And well, it goes some places, and you have stuff like Point Blank, but it also goes to the TV, and it goes to the Twilight Zone, and the idea of kind of it being still kind of World War II rattled veterans grappling with this weird universe, and like technology is taking off, and the kind of world is changing all around them. And so taking that Vic Morrow, that first episode, the John Landis one, as kind of that, as the kind of like already sweaty, already bitter kind of, ugly side of these guys who feel like they did their duty and now the world's passing them by. I really enjoyed it this time more than I expected. I thought it was just going to be kind of like this rough B-roll of like a half finished thing, but it I thought was as strong as the other ones.
Well, actually, before we jump into that, let's talk really quick about the prologue, because I agree. I think it's an amazing setup because it has a twist ending to it. Like we are cruising along, we're on a road trip, and there's a passenger and there's a driver. They don't have names, they don't really have any history, but they have a common love of TV and pop culture. And that's kind of what we're tapping into here, right? We're doing a nostalgic look back. We're getting a big screen version of this beloved TV show, and such an iconic theme. Like I love that lead in. It's like we're talking about theme music to the TV shows. And then we get like dee dee dee. It's like you don't have to say anything more than those 4 notes, and you immediately know we're talking Twilight Zone. And I love that as a kind of a way to get us into it, both into the mindset and into reminding us how much we love it. But yeah, the twist ending is so fun. Like, because they're comedians, they're making us laugh, and then suddenly it goes, wait, you want to see something really scary? I'm like, and also for me, that was really scary. Like Dan Aykroyd's face is terrifying.
When I saw that the prologue, I remember how it ends, and I don't really quite remember how I felt about it, but the sound effect they use of like the monster though kind of takes me out a little bit now.
Oh, like that sounds like a lion.
Yeah, it's like really, it's really kind of funny. It's like, they got the makeup is a little iffy now. Yeah, but like, man, I imagine I can't remember how I was, but I could totally see people being like, oh. I was laughing though beforehand because with all the memories, and like I feel like I've had that same conversation with people before about like, let's play the game and try to figure stuff out. It was just, I love that prologue.
It really eased me in, or it gave me a sense of ease and a sense of trust, the same way it did when I saw it as a kid. It pulled the same trick on me as an adult, and as a child, I knew who Dan Aykroyd was as Ray Stans from Ghostbusters, even though the film had not come out yet when Twilight Zone came out. But it has sort of established this blanket of trust. Okay, there are these 2 seemingly nice guys just having this conversation, and really, even though I knew what was going to happen this next time around when I watched it, it's just very effective. It just pulling you into these 2 guys bullshitting and being friendly and feeling comfortable, and then suddenly, do you want to see something scary?
I think that I don't think I had realized before also that it seems like Dan Aykroyd is a hitchhiker that he's picked up, or that they don't know each other. Like Dan Aykroyd has some line like, yeah, I know all about you. I know where you're from, or something like that. And then kind of leaves it hanging that like, well, we've already talked. And it seems like, I mean, I think it's meant to be open-ended, but I think reading something that they wanted Aykroyd kind of in each segment, or that he was going to be dropped off by Kathleen Quinlan in the Dante one, that it was going to be more of this kind of like linking segment to all the different stories. And so I thought like, oh, that's interesting that, yeah, it's not that this is some friend who's always been some monster. I mean, it has its own kind of, whatever dream logic. It's meant to make as much sense as it lasts. But I thought, oh, that's one more kind of trick, is that, there's at least one Twilight Zone episode about a phantom hitchhiker or some kind of ethereal figure that gets picked up on the road.
And that does kind of take us into the first segment, which is the one with Vic Morrow. It's called Time Out. And it kind of harkens back to the Twilight Zone episode, A Quality of Mercy, where Dean Stockwell plays a lieutenant at the end of World War II. And through some, magic twist, he is suddenly turned into a Japanese soldier. And so he sees the war from both sides. Vic Morrow is set up as a bigot who has been passed over for a promotion. Turns out that the person who's got the promotion is of a Jewish, descent. And he just kind of goes on a spree to his bar buddies about, how, well, basically it's just a string of racist epithets toward everybody. As he steps out of the bar, he finds himself in Nazi Germany as a Jew. He finds himself in the South as a Black person. He finds himself in Vietnam as a Vietnamese person. So it's kind of, and again, I agree with you, Niall. I think it seems so very on point as a Twilight Zone episode in terms of tone. It is darker and it is very much a morality lesson in a way that some of the others are not.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too that he doesn't change. It's just still Vic
Right.
Morrow through the whole thing, which I think now, especially because it is such an ugly tirade that begins with, by the way, the guy who plays Norris in The Thing. I'm not sure of the actor's name, but I was
Charles Hallahan.
Yeah. But I think it is the one way that it kind of goes down. Then after that, like, oof, this is a rough start, especially now in that bar, the Tinder trap. But that you don't have him changing, or thank goodness they didn't do like a C. Thomas Howell thing. But I think it adds to the strangeness of it too. That you're just seeing Vic Morrow in his same ever dirtier suit.
Well, and the tragedy, it was that during the Vietnamese segment, there was a helicopter that was going to be flying overhead, and Vic Morrow was supposed to be holding these two kids, and this was going to be like his moment of redemption, was that he was going to be saving these two Vietnamese kids. And unfortunately, during that scene, one of the explosives threw water up into the engine, and the engine cut out, and the helicopter crashed and decapitated Morrow and one of the kids and crushed the other. So it was a huge tragedy, and it basically changed the safety rules for filmmaking. And Landis and Spielberg, all of them were brought in, on charges of manslaughter. I think it was the first time that a film director had been brought in, as being responsible for an accident on set. And it did change the way safety regulations were held. And the tragedy of it, because they were shot sequentially. So this was the first episode being shot, and it kind of cast a pall over the rest of filmmaking. Spielberg has said that he took 6 days to shoot his segment, and his heart wasn't really in it.
What I had heard, I don't know if you all had heard different things, but I'd heard at least one version of the story where Spielberg wanted to do Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, but thought that it would be kind of too dark, but also some concern about the child actors in it. Like they would seem, upon release, it was just segment after segment of kind of terrorizing children. And so he opted out of adapting that one.
But I agree. I think it's a really effective episode. And Larry, I mean, I know you may have a differing view, so I want to hear that. But I feel like this one, when I watched it the first time and revisiting it again, I feel like it has a lot of power to it because it does drop us into some really uncomfortable situations. We see him getting a view from the other side, and to the end where he's being, taken away on the trains to the concentration camps. It's like, wow, that really had a punch for me.
Watching that segment now, seeing how people are still like that to this day, it really made me wonder if how people thought about this segment then, and then wonder how people would take to this segment now if they released something like this now. And unfortunately, that the accident happened, but I'm kind of glad they didn't try to redeem him, because I feel like the ending works so much better knowing that this guy didn't change, and he's just gonna, because he wasn't a nice person, he got his comeuppance. I think it works better. I think if he would have saved the kids, it would have been like, oh, I'm not racist anymore. I think that would have been really not something that I think the segment would have earned. Just real briefly, I didn't know about this until a couple years ago. There was a podcast that was going through all the 80s movies sequentially, by release date. To get to the Twilight Zone, they start talking about the John Landis thing. And I was like, oh my God, I don't know how John Landis basically got away with it, how he still had a career after it, and I'm, obviously good things came out of it. Tragedy still happened, but I'm sure they happened way less than they would have. but like he really lucked out by not having social media back then. Things would have turned out way differently, probably. But just the segment with, because I guess originally the segment was going to end the same way, but somebody said we got to redeem him, and I wish they would have just stayed that way the whole time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and yeah, to your point, I mean, Landis went on to do Trading Places. He went on to do, the Thriller, Michael Jackson's Thriller, like he had quite a career. And then I think it was in the later part of the 80s that the trial was resolving itself. And that's when things did start coming out about Landis. I don't know if the public knew as much as they eventually did.
Probably not. But then he got Coming to America, and that was a huge hit.
Right.
It really took Beverly Hills Cop 3, I think. It's when people were like, all right, dude. I bet you every day he wishes he would have done something differently that day.
Oh, yeah. Well, and how could he not? It's like, I mean, as opinionated and arrogant as he might seem and or have been, as Spielberg has gone on record saying, there's no film that's worth dying over.
Yeah.
And it was a tragic end for Vic Morrow, who's a terrific actor. And I think he gives an amazing performance here. Like you said, Niall, he doesn't change a lot, but we see a lot of colors within that. We see a very scared man, a completely out of his element. It's one thing to sit in a bar and throw out the epithets. It's another thing to find yourself, with the shoe on the other foot.
It almost seemed to me like he did have sort of a quiet change moment at the end when he was on the train lying on the ground looking up
and
at
he saw the others.
prisoners. This sort of quiet moment of acknowledgement as he looked at them. It was the first time he wasn't reacting angrily to what he was seeing, and he wasn't lashing out. I don't know. And to me, I kind of like that subtle. If that was supposed to be a redemptive moment, I prefer that subtle moment as opposed to kind of what you were describing before, the original ending. It kind of almost seemed like an Ebenezer Scrooge moment. It almost would have shifted the tone. So I do like the way that it ended. I'm sorry that the tragedy pushed it in that direction, but I did find it to be fitting.
Shifting ahead to Spielberg's episode, which is Kick the Can. That was originally in season 3. It was episode number 86. And that takes place in an old folks retirement home. Landis's episode is the one that was kind of like original, whereas the others are remakes. But Dodd, since you did speak to having some affection for this one, go ahead and lead us into it.
Sure. I mean, as I mentioned before, as a kid seeing that was sort of the installment that offered the least amount of terror. In fact, it was the opposite. It was the uplifting moment of the movie. So as a kid, I was kind of going, boring, bring back the monsters. And it's kind of funny. I still had that memory. And then going into the second segment, I went, okay, I'm just going to put this on cruise control and go through the Spielberg, the sappy Spielberg segment. And it did impact me. And I think that's because as an older viewer than when I was a child, I was hanging on the dialogue so much more. And the Scatman Crothers character infusing this sort of wisdom, or giving this wisdom to these characters about appreciating aging while trying to keep your mind alive and appreciating, every moment you have on Earth. It hit me right here. Mm-hmm. It really did, more than it ever had. And when it was over, I was getting a little teary-eyed, and I was going, wow, I have a new appreciation for the Spielberg segment. Absolutely.
Well, it's funny. I'm still the opposite in the sense that, like, I don't currently have kids or anything like that. And it was just, I'm just way too cynical still for that segment to work for me, but I think what's cool about it though is how, and you brought it up just a minute ago, was how when you see a movie at a certain age, it really helps to see them in different parts of your life, because then you really get a different appreciation for them. Whereas like as a kid, I was probably like, I don't understand any of this. This is third kids now. This is dumb. But like now as an adult, I was like, well, I get what the message was at least, and I think that's something that I think we all struggle with, especially when we're like with the work and stuff, is just trying to stay young and in a mind and whatnot. So like I appreciated that's the segment, but it was also just really obnoxious. Like Mr. Agee, it turns into this like really annoying Peter Pan character that I'm just like, just shut up, kid. But it was fun though. Like I recognize some of those older actors,
Yeah.
too. I was like, oh, it's like a lot of like that guy's and that girl's in that one. I thought so that was really kind of fun to see, but it was just real sappy for me right now. But the other thing I thought of too during it is I know this is the Twilight Zone movie, but really this is like the blueprint for amazing stories, the movie. Because this was like the most amazing stories segment. It just felt like no wonder they made that TV show, because I feel like Spielberg just wanted to do short anthology stuff, and that's where that show came from. This really felt like the most amazing stories episode, so I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think that is apt, that it's sort of the proto-Amblin entertainment, or like you can see almost, if you see the two segments, as kind of an arm wrestle for what will the 80s kind of be about. Will it be the Goonies, or will it be American Werewolf in Paris or in London? And it's certainly not American Werewolf in London after this, most of all. And so, there's still, I think, that petulant kid in me, like, oh, it's the sappy one. But I think I did appreciate this time that, just the character actor side, and having seen the Fabelmans and enjoyed that, like kind of seeing it as this X-ray of Spielberg's kind of, appetite for bringing the whole family in. You get to use your grandparents, you get to use the kind of golden years character actors, but you also get to work with kids, and also as this kind of maybe atoning for the loss, talking behind the scenes, but atoning for the loss and the tragedy, the fact that they were made sequentially, and he was running through a couple of different things that he did before choosing this one. And so for that's great. I think the other thing that struck me, that it's not within the story, but just how young on the spectrum of old all the old people in the old folks home are. I'm like, these guys seem fine. In today's standards, they'd have another 15 years of work. They'd be the people still running things, not watching Jeopardy at 2 p.m. And so it was just interesting too to see how much in 40 years time, from 83 to 2023, that we've at least prolonged what we can see as someone put out to pasture. And then, just like the info, the guy who's telling them about different vitamins that are important and how that can, kind of keep you going, what that would be now, and how like freaky and like the psychopharmacological, like bio life presentation, how much more like sinister or Pinchonian it could be, instead of just like, yeah, vitamin E is good if you're, still feeling the urges. So that was all, fun to see.
You know what? It was funny when you mentioned that, is when I found out that Vic Morrow was 53 when he died in that segment.
Oh, wow.
I was like, that dude looked like in his late 60s. I'm like, man, I'm glad that we've gotten better at how we've aged. Because, I mean, we all look great. And some of us might be close to his age, It's just like, I thought that was just kind of funny. And that was a great point, because I was like, man, there's one old lady in that one that looked like she was like in her 50s. I'm like, what are you doing here?
I couldn't help but pick up on what they refer to as the magical Negro cliche that was present with the Scatman Crothers character. And it seems to me, I can think of one other example. Scatman Crothers played a similar role in The Shining. And I'm wondering if he played other roles. Because he just sort of had that grandfatherly, he always sort of played these grandfatherly characters that had sort of this magical sense to, or a magical way about them. And so, but I picked up on that because that was always such a repetitive cliche in movies, even into the future. The Green Mile, The Legend of Bagger Vance. And then prior to this, I would argue The Song of the South. So I did pick up on that and made a note of that being a genre trope that was happening.
Right. And he is the only person of color in that entire retirement home, and then he goes to another one where it seems like he is again just surrounded by, here, let me just help all you white folks recognize that you don't have to age. One interesting thing is, because I did watch the original Twilight Zone episodes prior to watching the movie, and the way that the TV show episode ends is that all of them turn into kids and they disappear. They just run off into the night. And again, that's it. That's the last you see of them. And whereas this one, they are kids for a while, and then they learn to appreciate being older, but just keeping that young mind and keeping that young heart. And so they go back to being old again. And I was like, wow, that is such a different message. And it's different in terms of what the Twilight Zone tone would have been, because a bunch of kids, a bunch of old people turning into young kids and then disappearing into the night and leaving the one old guy alone, that feels very Twilight Zone. Whereas this feels a little more Spielberg.
Why did that one character decide to stay young? What's your take on why? I didn't quite. I think maybe because he didn't have kids or something. I wonder what was.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating, and I remembered that when I watched it the first time, but I'd forgotten that all of them just run off and kind of follow that same path. And I think it is what the other concerns that the other old folks were, voicing was that, I miss I wouldn't have met the people that I met, and I'd have to go through all that again. Whereas he's kind of like, I am totally down for that. Like, I want a replay of my life. I loved my life. What I didn't love was getting old and not being able to move the way I wanted to move. And I feel like that for him, it was a recapturing of his physicality. And that was something, I mean, you can stay young in mind, but if you can't do what you want to do just physically, then why not go back?
He made it very clear that he was horny as well. and going through the highlights of his youth, he was, and sex. And so I agree with you, though. I thought he was just unattached and he wanted to go back and live it up.
Shifting ahead to our third segment, directed by Joe Dante. This is It's a Good Life, but we have a young character named Anthony, who has the ability to do anything with his mind. And in the original, he just makes the rest of the world disappear except for his little town of Peaksville, Ohio. And he keeps wishing things away, like, neighbors and cats and dogs and cows. And, eventually you just feel like there's this just devastating sense of everything getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And everybody having to say, that's a good thing you did, Anthony. We're really glad you did that. That was awesome that you did that. Do you have to do that? Well, okay, but if you do that, that's okay. And that's what I love about the episode. The TV show is just like, there's so much dread and tension all the way throughout. And when it ends, he just decides he wants to make it snow in the middle of summer. And the father's like, that'll kill half the crops. But it's a good thing that you're doing that. It's a good thing. So we look ahead to Joe Dante's adaptation, which is a different beast. Niall, you spoke to this one. I'll let you kind of do the intro on it.
The fact that Dante's getting to play around with the things that interest Joe Dante first and foremost, and watching it again, the dialing it up to 11, which is a lot of fun. But yeah, it becomes less of this parable of how, as you say, things just keep getting taken away or things getting changed, and it's this kind of constant having to think happy thoughts. And you get a little bit of it in this one that right. Anthony can read the minds of the people around him and they have to keep thinking nice things, but it's much more about the kind of grotesque result of having a little kid running everything with unlimited power. So the food right. is disgusting, like it's a bunch of candy, and then like there's peanut butter on the burger. The things that I think still freak me out and are kind of burned into my mind from that first viewing are the kind of uncanny things even before there's the creatures, the kind of practical effect rabbit and the practical effect kind of Tasmanian devil or just kind of imp that comes out of the TV, but the sister with no mouth.
Oh my God.
And then also the hallway even leading up to that is one of the most eerie and uncanny distressing things I've ever seen, which is that like there's a portrait of people but they have no faces, and like even the kind of like perspective of the stairwell is very bizarre. And I think I had seen as a kid Beetlejuice, and so like some of that like amazing kind of set pieces and bizarre like kind of elaborate Art Deco almost set design was familiar to me as a fan of the kind of spooky PG level spooky stuff. But that one, it really is still like this kind of unparalleled bizarre plane that they're in. And Kevin McCarthy's performance, I think also, I mean, the whole family is great, but Kevin McCarthy, especially, just like this goofy, but still kind of terrifying and dread-filled performance. Like when they go through the Kathleen Quinlan's purse, the teacher who, she backs over the little boy's bike and then takes him to his house. But like the panic that they're going through the stuff. And again, I think if you've seen the episode, oh, well, they don't really have any food. They don't have any makeup. All these kind of things have gone because the little boy doesn't care about those things. So they're all kind of the cigarettes. But what you get in that episode or in that segment from the film, you don't really get too much context for why they're kind of going through a purse. They just seem kind of antic and crazed. And I think that stuff is really its strength is Dante getting to like really make a living cartoon, but a living cartoon like made in hell or made in the Twilight Zone. I mean, it's a dark-hearted thing.
Dodd?
I'm gonna have to do a digression on this one. Watching this as a parent is a whole other nightmare. Well, because I was really thinking back. My boys are 13 now; they're twins, but just throughout life, you take them to places and you see that kid throwing the tantrum out in public, and then the parents are like, just give him the goddamn iPad and give him what he wants. And it really was, to me, an embodiment of that sort of, how far will a kid take it if you give him too much power? Who's pulling the strings, in this family dynamic? And unfortunately, sometimes the parents do let it go too far. And I think that this is just a really embellished, cartoony, horrific version of that. And I really embraced it in a different set of eyes watching it.
I have to give a shout out real quick to Dick Miller and the people at that restaurant. Because, so obviously Dick Miller's amazing. So it's great to see him show up. But
as Walter Paisley.
I thought the acting in that scene was really good because you can sort of tell that they know that don't mess with this kid. And that one guy's like, I've had enough, and he's pushed this kid down, but you can totally tell that they like know he can do something to mess him up. So I thought the acting there was really good, where they're just like they're on edge and they had just had enough, and just kind of enough to kind of give you that whole thing like there's something off with this kid, And then when you get into his house and it's just one giant weird cartoon with all the fluorescent like weird 80s lighting that actually kind of gives me the creeps now. That whole I was just really uneasy that entire segment, especially knowing that his sister has no mouth. That always creeped me out as a kid. And the acting too, from like the ones that are stuck there, his parents and grandparents or whatnot. I think they're his parents, but they made it seem like they stole them or something.
I think they've been adopted, adopted, and they've been, he's been kidnapped basically, and then trapped in the house.
Yeah, I think that's why they wanted that stuff for the purse, was because like they needed something of what they're used to, like the smoking stuff, like they all were smoking and everything. And the other funny part too, now looking back, the other sister is Nancy Cartwright, who's Bart Simpson, who is basically that. Bart Simpson is that character essentially without all the wishes. So it's even more fun just kind of hear that voice like in terror of the kid who was basically a Bart Simpson with unlimited wishes. So that was totally kind of fun about it.
I was gonna say that on didn't they do a Simpsons Treehouse of Terror that was spoofing this segment? Yeah,
they did, and Terror at 35,000 feet. I don't think it's a different one, but with the like George Miller style gremlin. Yeah.
What I love about the TV version is that everybody treats Anthony very carefully. And were he to push Anthony down, like Anthony would have just like, bye, you're gone. And I got this, that was where I was like, I'm not sure, but I like the fact that maybe Anthony is savvy enough that he's like, I can't do anything out in the real world. I have to get them home to where I run the place. Which is different, of course, than the TV show. But I like that idea of like, okay, I will go here. I will, get, unless that's part of the deal that somebody like he has told them, okay, you have to push me down because then that will draw sympathy toward me. And then someone will take me home. I don't know, but I love kind of like spiraling that one out because his adopted family, such as it is it's so great that they've all been brought there and they can't leave. They cannot leave, and they have to live in Anthony's world.
Did anyone feel a sense of hope at the open-endedness of it? Like, did you feel that Kathleen Quinlan was going to be able to quote unquote fix this kid?
Yes, and I don't know that I like it very much.
Yeah.
Like,
I'm with
like
you,
I
I'm with
feel
you.
like that felt kind of certainly counter to the original episode, but also kind of like, why does she have the magic touch?
Was she a teacher, a school teacher? Did they mention that in the
Yes.
Yeah.
episode? Okay, so maybe that was the magic touch.
It's a very pro teacher episode, which is nice.
Yeah. They're just not getting paid enough to deal with this kid.
that they never will get paid enough.
No.
Especially if they do wishes to make weird cartoon characters come to life.
Let us lurch forward into our fourth episode, which so an interesting little side note is that after the tragedy occurred, Landis and George Miller, who directed this final version, they were not present for post-production. Like, they were not there in the editing room. They just basically shot their stuff and got out, which I find amazing considering how much like a George Miller film the final episode, Nightmare 40,000 Feet, is. The original episode was season 5. It starred William Shatner as a terrified passenger who had gone through a couple of nervous breakdowns, and here he was coming home. We don't get that backstory with the John Lithgow version, but we do get the sense that he's really, really, really scared of flying. Larry, you want to lead us into this one?
Sure, yeah. Obviously, this was a favorite segment as a kid, and it's still a favorite segment now, just because how George Miller manages to make the small airplane just feel propulsive with all this stuff, with all the Dutch camera angles and stuff, the weird close-ups they would do like the 80s. He makes everything just feel claustrophobic during this whole thing, which makes you feel like the Lithgow character a lot, because like the way they film him, he just looks terrified about everything, and then you got this gremlin out there with just amazing, just like animatronic stuff they do with it. I love the design of the practical effect there, but like Lithgow is just always, he is an amazing actor, because he can play the nicest person or like the scariest person or like the most nervous, and like what a casting choice they had with him. Like it was just, I was along for the ride the whole time with because of Lithgow's performance, I think.
Yeah, he had just come off of World According to Garp, which he'd got nominated for an Oscar, but he'd had a career long before that. He'd done Brian De Palma's Obsession and Blowout, but yeah, he was certainly becoming a name. And it's funny because I guess on Third Rock from the Sun, they did something to the effect of, because William Shatner played the big brain on that one, and they had a little like a moment of like, I had, there was something on the plane. He's like, that happened to me too. But I think Shatner is really good in the TV episode, and I think Lithgow is extraordinary in this one. And to your point, Larry, I think Miller's camera work is just astonishing, and it's funny how each one of these really does capture the spirit of the director. Like, it doesn't feel like they all try to flatten it out and make it all, be part of a whole. Like, each one of them is embracing their own directorial flourishes. Yes, it's a combination of animatronics. That's Craig Reardon doing the makeup effects for the Gremlin, and he did like Dreamscape and things like that. But that's a guy in a suit, and I love guys in suits. And when you compare this guy in a suit versus to the TV show guy in a suit, who basically looks like some kind of like weird koala bear.
The best part of what I loved about that gremlin, though, when he's waving his finger like you can't say anything, that thing is stuck in my head my whole life, I think.
In terms of George Miller, I was refamiliarizing myself with what he'd done before, and it was just the first 2 Mad Max films. So I found it interesting that he went from the Australian outback to an airplane cabin. Very claustrophobic transition in terms of setting, but with a new set of lenses watching it, I think because I was expecting the gremlin, and that had already traumatized me as a child. The part I found scarier on this and made it worse was these passengers that are surrounding him. They're almost like these caricatures of awful people. You have the air marshal, who's this sweaty big guy who's always just staring him down like he wants to choke him. And you have this disruptive kid with a ventriloquist dummy of all things on the plane. Sort of just these images that are not going to calm you down if you're already feeling not at ease on an airplane flight. So I thought that was kind of interesting, where these other sort of horrific elements of people that were on this plane, in addition to the actual monster that was on the wing of the plane.
I was surprised when the air marshal finally speaks that he speaks in an American accent, because I thought for sure this guy is going to be mute. And so I thought for sure, like, this is some guy George Miller found in some small backwater, just like tending bar or something, like, a diet of Fosters and like steaks. And then he speaks and like, oh no, they found this guy somewhere, because he just looks like he stepped out of, he came from the Outback with George Miller. But yeah, the malevolent almost little girl with the Polaroid camera and with the W.C. Fields, is it? It almost looks like that's just a model of ventriloquist dummy, but like kind of haranguing him the entire time. It really is like the horror of the plane is kind of with each segment. Even the way that the co-pilot or the pilot, whoever it is, who kind of like tries to like calm Lithgow down, like, look, we're in a storm. This is bad. Right. I need you to be calm. Even the way that those are shot, again, it feels kind of like this tension of like a film noir or, a movie from the late 40s, early 50s, where, it's a bad situation. It's already, it seems like, the worst flight ever because of this storm. And then it's made even worse by the monster. But like it's already, to me, I'm a nervous flyer, that like this is already terrible. You don't even need the gremlin to be as terrified as Lithgow.
What I love about this is because I'd never seen this done in a film prior to this, was the shattering of the window and the pressure of the cabin like exploding. Like we're just like, because in the TV show he kind of breaks his way out and he's being pulled alongside, but like the idea that no, if you break the window of an airplane, it will mess everything up inside. And like people are just panicking and like, I got to keep this guy from flying out the window. And it's just, I love that effect. I'd never seen anything like it before. Word to the wise, everybody, don't break the windows. It's not helpful, even if you're trying to shoot a gremlin down. I also love the fact that gremlin is so nimble and agile. And it's like, it kind of does the thing in the Mario Bava movie Shock, where it kind of disappears from frame and then just pops up like right in front of you.
Yeah, the other thing that's funny about that segment is how different air travel is now. Because like I still to this day can't imagine how we allowed smoking on an airplane. It is the weirdest thing. I wonder if you can do a segment like that now. Like what does that look like if air travel it is today? That'd be interesting.
Well, I feel like, didn't Jordan Peele, I know he did one of these episodes on his new iteration of Twilight Zone. I can't remember if it was this one or It's a Good Life. I feel like it was this one.
It was a bit different. It had Adam, I can't think of his last name, from Severance, Adam Scott, and it was this thing where he was listening to a podcast the whole time. I can't remember how it transpired, but it definitely was a different variation on it. Where he starts freaking out over what he's hearing on a podcast. I think the podcast is predicting that the plane's going to crash, and he starts freaking out on the plane.
Oh, interesting. So there's no gremlin. Yeah. I imagine if there was a gremlin, you'd remember the gremlin.
I think so. Yeah. Did anyone though see the 2020 film Shadow in the Cloud with Chloe Grace Moritz?
I haven't.
So it's almost like a variation on this, because it's set in World War II, and she gets on this plane, and there's a gremlin that starts tearing up the plane. And coincidentally enough, the screenplay was originally written by Max Landis. And then he had the accusations brought against him, and they rewrote it to make it more of a story about female empowerment.
What's it called? What's the movie?
Shadow in the Cloud.
Shadow in the Cloud.
Yeah, I think I saw it on streaming when we were all locked up. So
the other thing I learned yesterday when I was just kind of looking up some facts, there's a novelization of the movie, and it was done before it was all edited or whatever, apparently. And the last segment was actually the second segment, and the Spielberg one was last, which would have made the movie completely different. Because like I don't even know, because the way it ends now, like it goes from that segment and just kind of works. And like I kind of want to pick up this novelization and kind of see what the prologue or the epilogue is like.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you what you said earlier in the episode, Larry. Like it just seems like it ramps up. The energy is different from 1 to 2, but then from like 2 to 3 to 4, it's just like a roller coaster.
Yeah, and I think of anthology films. Usually they try to save the best for last, and
Mhm.
that doesn't always work, but it definitely works in this one.
Yeah, I agree. Like the George Miller one is my favorite of the bunch. I feel like it's the most fully realized, and it also, because it doesn't deviate much from the episode, there isn't, if anything, I feel like it improves on what the TV episode brought, and I like that. I mean, there are times when I see adaptations where it's like, why are you trying to, like, go fix the episodes that didn't work? Like, go take one that it wasn't as successful. But I feel like he took everything that was good about the original and then just took it up another level.
Well, and I agree with you. I was only going to add that, and the gremlin gets away.
Yes,
He gets away. Like, the flare gun doesn't kill him, and like that is just different from the Joe Dante ending for It's a Good Life and some of the other ones. Like, that's the most distressing thing about the whole thing. The gremlin flies away into a cloud.
it's still out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that gremlin thing though is I do think about it every now and then. I'm on the plane, like if I'm by like the wing, like I'll look outside when it's at night. I go, okay, I think we're good.
Well, and also I think what Miller does so well is with the lighting and the flashes is you don't ever get like a great look at it. Like, you get the one hero shot of him at the window, but even then you got all the water and everything. Like, you just don't get like a great shot. And I think that's perfect. Like, seeing it out there on the engine is terrifying because you're kind of like, what am I even looking at? Like, and you see, like, it pulling things up and you're like, it looks like it's pulling things up. I can't be 100%. Rod Serling and Richard Matheson, who wrote the original episode, were traveling together, and Rod Serling had set something up where he had a picture of the gremlin from the TV show pasted to the window of this, like, prop plane that they were going to be flying in. And so the curtains were closed, and like at the magic moment, he was going to, like, hey, Dick, look out the window. And then there was going to be the gremlin there. And just as Rod was about to say, hey, Dick, look out the window, they started up the engines and the paper just flew away, like flew off. And he'd spent like months, like, like putting this together.
Speaking of Rod Sterling, I'm kind of curious how you guys felt about them using Burgess Meredith as the voiceover between each episode, because it's such a different sounding voice than you're used to.
Agreed. I think for me, because Burgess Meredith had appeared in, 4 different Twilight Zone episodes, he was, very much, he felt like a good person to carry the baton on. I agree. But nobody does Serling like Serling. I mean, like, Serling's voice and his speech patterns are so specific. So I'm glad in some ways that they didn't try and do an impression of Rod Serling. And again, it seemed like Meredith was a good choice to carry it on. Other thoughts?
I had read that they wanted somehow to kind of incorporate him in, like, existing footage, like kind of like Forrest Gump kind of thing, and either just because it was already not the favorite child of Warner Brothers, that they kind of abandoned that idea. But I guess I was watching it on my television, so I couldn't see if this is true, but I guess his reflection is in the eye at the beginning.
Rod Serling's?
You see Rod Serling's silhouette. So that was their kind of little nod, and they use his voice, I guess, at the at the end.
Yeah.
But that, they wanted to kind of have him maybe superimposed or have people around him as if he was still introducing and then making the closing remarks. Fun fact, just another thing, not about Serling, but about just how long this was gestating. I guess originally Miracle Mile, that movie, the kind of nuclear panic in downtown LA, or like by La Brea Tar Pits, was considered for one of the segments at some point. That the script was being passed around, and Warner Brothers, it was first at Warner Brothers, they're going to make it, and they knew they were making a Twilight Zone, and then think maybe also they were thinking of franchising it before, obviously, the tragic events, and so they thought, well, if not for this one, then it'll be for Twilight Zone the movie 2.
The accident did just kind of cast a pall over it, and it was released, and I don't feel like critics of the time, and maybe this is right, maybe they shouldn't have tried to separate the incidents from the film itself, but I feel like there was, like, everybody just kind of felt dirty watching it and talking about it, and so it did not get the love that perhaps it deserved. I mean, I feel like, I don't know that it's necessarily a flawless piece, but I think it has a lot of merit to it. And I think watching it as a young kid, not being aware of all the other stuff, I was kind of like, I really like this movie. Why don't more people talk about it? And then you get older and you find out that's why more people don't talk about it. The most recent home video releases don't have any special features. They have like, a theatrical trailer with all the trivia that's surrounding this film. I would feel like this is just ripe for a commentary and some documentaries and things like that. It just feels like it's one of those things that Warner Brothers would just like to pretend didn't happen. It's a weird kind of place to live for a film.
It's very timely with the whole controversy over the Rust movie with Alec Baldwin, and then
Right.
prior to that, there was that film that William Hurt was in about the Allman Brothers, where there was a crew person was hit by a train and killed. And so we've had these timely moments that have made me think about this incident.
There is a book about the whole thing. I can't remember the title right now.
Outrageous Conduct.
Have you read that at all?
I haven't read. I just, when I was doing a little bit of research for the episode, I heard about it, and so I've got it on hold at the library. So
Nice.
yeah, but it's called Outrageous Conduct by Stephen Farber and Mark Green. And for any of the folks who are interested in looking back at the original Twilight Zone, there's a book called The Twilight Zone Companion by Mark Scott Zicree, and that basically takes us through every single episode. It has the information about when it was released and kind of the synopses. It has Serling's opening and closing remarks.
I do kind of wonder what everybody thinks as far as this movie being an anthology movie. Do you think it's a top tier anthology movie, or is it sort of in the middle?
I would throw that around. And also, what is your favorite anthology film?
I'd love to go with Creepshow.
Yeah, that's classic. I just watched one recently. They're on a train, and I think Christopher Lee is in it.
Yeah, it's Dr. Terror's House of Horrors.
Yeah, that one is awesome. I like that one a lot. That one I just recently saw, and there's another one too. I can't remember offhand. It's like a lower budget local one that does found footage horror before found footage horror is a thing, and it's like a
fun.
70s movie.
This is upper to mid, mid to upper tier anthology. I also it just struck me, I don't know why, but like this kind of predates the era of a bunch of independent filmmakers making short films and then putting them all together into an anthology film, like the VHS movies, Theater Bazaar, etc. XX, but in this case, it was always conceived as we're going to be, attaching it to a central theme.
I find it interesting. I don't know. You mentioned the VHS films, but really you don't see as many filmmakers doubling down on anthology films. And I think that's because I would attribute that to the advent of streaming. When you made an anthology film, you were serving up a 5-course meal, and now people want to eat the appetizer, maybe go do something, come back later for the second course. Like with Black Mirror recently that came on Netflix, just the way it's all broken apart.
Just real quick, the movie I had to look it up. It's called The House of the Dead. It's from 1978. I think it's Pennsylvania.
You were telling me about this.
Horror.
Oh, I've seen that. Yeah, that's a really interesting one.
Yeah, I really like that one. And like I said, it has a found footage horror segment before that's a thing. So I was like, wow, they're ahead of its time. So that is a hidden gem for all those who are watching this. They should go.
Where did you find it?
It's on Tubi TV. The great Tubi TV.
Niall, any anthology thoughts?
Gosh, I think this one is special just because they are different filmmakers working on it for the era that seems, kind of unique. I'm a big Black Sabbath, the Mario Bava fan, either the AIP version or the Italian version. Somebody's dubbed. Karloff's dubbed in the one that's in Italian, or the Italian actors are dubbed in the one where Karloff gets use his own voice. So they're both great. But yeah, I think that this one ranks high, and I think because I saw it before I saw Creepshow or Dead Time Stories or any of those, it's kind of further back, and so it feels kind of like the first time being kind of exposed to the idea that you could have one film made out of a bunch of little films. And I just came across this. I guess it was not a genre, but although kind of it was a Hollywood thing that was popular in the 30s and 40s. They called it the Portmanteau film, and there was this specific French director, Jules, I can't remember his last name, but he did Flesh and Fantasy, but he also did Tales of Manhattan. There's another one called If I Had a Million, and even watching some of those, you're like, oh, most of the stories in the middle aren't very good. Like they go in, strong in the beginning, and they've got, some fun ones in the end. And then they're just like W.C. Fields and he finds a coin or something. Like there's some real weak links. That said, I feel like this one is strong in that, all the segments have something to offer, the way that even Dead of Night, that early British, kind of the proto Tales from the Crypt, Amicus House Tales from the Crypt, rather,
Right.
has some ones that are just like, oh, you just needed to kind of fill it in the middle to get to your feature film length. Whereas this one, I feel like there's something to enjoy in all of them.
Yeah, for sure. And that Dead of Night that you referenced, those are each segment's directed by another director as well. So
right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. Well, thank you all. This was lovely. I knew it would be. If you want to check out more from my guests, I'll have stuff in the description below. If you enjoyed this episode, please click the old subscribe button, because you won't want to miss what we have coming up next, and hit that thumb, because it actually makes a difference for everybody. So until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.